Wife swap agreements and its consequences. It was 5:30 Sunday morning, and I had already been awake for at least half an hour. I tried to sleep, but I was too excited. Nancy was sleeping peacefully next to me, her long blonde hair hiding her beautiful facial features in the pre-dawn light. I carefully slipped out of bed so as not to wake her and went down to the kitchen. I put the coffee on to brew and stared out the window at the brightening sky in the east, my mind racing with the question, how could I let this happen? How could I have jeopardized my marriage like that? I had to admit that I had enjoyed myself the night before, but I don't think it was worth the price I would have to pay this morning. It all started last Saturday night when my friend John suggested that we get together for dinner and a movie, which meant that we would each contribute something to the dinner and we would rent a movie. When we got to John's house, he and I went to the garage to look at the '69 Firebird he was restoring. We were talking about cars and drinking beer when Jill came out and said that she and Nancy would make dinner and clean up if they were allowed to pick out a movie for the evening. John and I agreed to their terms and opened another mug of beer each. For dinner, we had T-bone steak, baked potato and salad, and 2 bottles of excellent red wine. After dinner, John and I sat in the living room and watched the baseball game while the girls cleaned up the kitchen. After finishing up in the kitchen, the girls ran to the video store to get a movie. When Nancy and Jill returned with the movie, John had a pitcher of whiskey ready in the blender, and we sat down at the table to watch the movie. The girls had rented The Ice Storm. They probably thought it was going to be a fancy movie, but I'm not sure what I would have called it. It was a quirky movie with weird subplots. The most important thing about this movie was a scene about a wife-swapping party. The time period of the movie was the 70s, and it was a stereotypical swapper party where the men would put their car keys in a bowl and the women would pull the keys to see who they would have sex with. This scene in the movie didn't become important until closer to the evening. After the movie, we sat around drinking whiskey and discussing the many strange characters in the movie and how it ended. By then, I had had a lot to drink and was feeling no pain, and I think everyone else was pretty tipsy too. It was at this point that John said, "What did you think of that wife-swapping party? Do you think anyone else does that?" I replied, "I doubt it, not in this day and age." Nancy asked, "Do you really think so?" I replied, "It's too dangerous. Maybe you could find some couples who would switch if they all knew each other well enough to feel safe." Then John asked me, "If you had the opportunity to go to a party like this and you knew it was safe, that there was no AIDS or herpes or anything like that, would you do it?" I looked at my wife to see her reaction, but before I could notice anything in her expression, John interrupted me. "Don't look at her. I didn't ask what she'd like to do. What would you like to do?" Since I'd had too much to drink, I didn't really think through my answer. I just rambled. "Well, it's always been a fantasy of mine to do something like that, but I really don't think I'd ever go for it." Both women looked at me like I had just pooped on the floor, and John was laughing at the top of his lungs. John then turned to the women and asked, "Have any of you thought about switching?" I could tell John was pissed. Otherwise, he would never have asked such a question. Jill replied, "I fantasized about it a couple of times when I've read stories about it or seen it portrayed in movies like today. But it's just a fantasy. I would never actually do it." Nancy then said, "I've thought about it, but I don't think I'd go for it either." I was drunk enough to say probably the stupidest thing I've ever said, even if I only meant it as a joke. "Well, we're all friends. Maybe we should try it together." Saying that, I laughed, but noticed that my wife didn't even smile and John was laughing with me. John said, "I'm all for it, but I know you're a coward. You'll never have the courage to do this." I should have known John was mocking me by challenging me, but in my not-so-clear state, I challenged him back. "Don't underestimate me." This time, I didn't look at either woman. I considered it a matter of honor. John said, "Okay, let's do it right now." I said, "I don't think that would be a good idea. I think we've all had too much to drink. We'll have to do it another time." Chickening out already? Asked John. I was actually trying to get out of the hole I'd dug for myself, but I wasn't about to be called a coward. No, I'm not backing down. Let's do it next week. That's when I came up with an idea that I thought would give me at least some chance of getting out of this situation. I said, let's have a game. We'll come here next Saturday night at 7 o'clock. When we get here, you and I will put pieces of paper with our names on them in an envelope. The girls will draw one slip out of the envelope each, and the one who draws my name will go away with me. Does that work for you? John agreed, and then asked, and what guarantees can you give that you'll succeed? I replied, the same guarantee you can give. Each of us will contribute $1,000. If one of us doesn't go for it, he loses his money. John thought for a moment, then said, done. I noticed that Nancy and Jill hadn't uttered a word the entire time John and I were discussing the terms of our wife-swapping agreement. When they were still silent afterward, I decided it was probably time to go home. I knew I was going to get in trouble, but I was still drunk enough to think it wasn't a big deal. How wrong I was. As soon as we got in the car, it started. How could you? You think I'm some kind of cheater that you can just walk away? That's not going to happen, so you better call John tomorrow and settle this matter. The rest of the drive home went the same way, and this continued for another hour after we got home. Finally, she let me go to bed. When I got up in the morning, I had a terrible hangover. My head hurt so bad I couldn't sit up, and my stomach was so upset I couldn't eat anything. And all the while I was being urged to call John. It wasn't until almost 3 in the afternoon that I felt well enough to call. After we exchanged greetings, I said, it was a little party we had last night. We got really drunk. John agreed and said, I still have a bit of a headache. I asked, how did it go after I left? Did you get any comments about the party we have planned for next weekend? When John spoke, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach with a fist. No backstabbing. We're both looking forward to Saturday. What about you? Did you have any problems? I don't know why, but I lied. No problems. John said, good, because I'd hate to take $1,000 from you. I said, don't worry, we'll be there. I then hung up the phone. When I turned around, she was standing there with a look that could kill a large animal, and I was the animal she wanted to kill. I didn't hear you tell him you weren't going to go through with it. I heard you say we're coming on Saturday. Why? I told her it was about money. I said, I'm sorry I got us into this, but I don't know how to get out of it without losing $1,000. I need time to figure something out. If I don't come up with anything, we're going to have to sacrifice the money. I looked down at my feet for a moment, and when I looked up again, she was gone. For the rest of the week, our house was very quiet. She didn't speak to me, and I knew it was best not to try to make conversation. I wanted to know what she was thinking. I was afraid of losing the money, but I was even more afraid of losing her. So I was going to let her do whatever she felt like doing. I hoped she would at least let me know what she was thinking. All day Saturday, we never talked. Finally, at 5:30 p.m., I found a note on the kitchen table addressed to me. The note said, we can't afford to lose $1,000. I will be ready on time. There was no signature. My wife is an attractive and sexy woman, and I always enjoy watching her get dressed to go out, but this evening the bedroom door was locked. I had to shower in the guest bathroom. By the time I was done showering, the bedroom door was open and I was able to go in and get dressed. After getting dressed, I sat down on the bed to contemplate what was happening. All week, up until I received the note, all I had been thinking about was how to get out of this situation and not lose the money. But now that my wife said she would be involved, I realized that I didn't care about the money. Now I couldn't get the thought of her having sex with John out of my head, and I didn't like what I was thinking. The thought of leaving her with John overnight for sex was tying my stomach in knots. I was still thinking about it and mentally and physically distressed when I heard a voice say, "It's time." For a moment I thought it was in my head, but then I realized it was my wife speaking. who was waiting for me downstairs. When I got downstairs, she was pulling her raincoat out of the closet. She was dressed in a short black skirt and white blouse, black stockings and black high-heeled shoes, and when I took the keys, she put the cape on and walked out to the car. On the way to John's house, we were silent. When we stopped in front of the house, I said, "I don't want you to have to do this. Let me just pay him the money and we can forget about all this. I love you and I'll make it up to you somehow." For a second, I thought she was silent, but finally she said, "I'm going to go through this to teach you a lesson. The next time you think about making any kind of commitment that involves me, you better be sure I agree. Besides, when this is over, you'll give me the $1,000 because I deserve it. John is going to have a great time tonight." I felt like she had just ripped my heart out, and before I could recover, she was out of the car and heading for the door. John met us at the door and led us into the living room and offered us a drink. I declined. I wasn't sure I could stay on my feet. For a moment, we all froze, feeling awkward. Jill and Nancy were standing next to each other. Both women were beautiful in different ways. Jill is tall, with short brunette hair and a very sexy body. Nancy is a little shorter than Jill. She has shoulder-length blonde hair and a sexy body as well. Looking at them, I began to have mixed feelings. If we ended up switching, I might be able to have a good time. And if not, I could start to repair the damage done to our marriage. John broke the awkward silence. "So, shall we do this?" With those words, he handed me a pencil and a piece of paper. While I wrote my name on the paper, John did the same on another piece of paper. We each folded our piece of paper and put it in an envelope. John held out the envelope to Nancy and said, "You take it out first, but don't look at the name yet." Nancy's hand trembled as she slipped her fingers into the envelope, pulled out one of the pieces of paper and clutched it in her hand. John held the envelope out to Jill and said, "Your turn." Jill took out the remaining piece of paper and waited to see what to do next. John shifted from foot to foot, then cleared his throat, which indicated that he was probably as nervous as I was, but I wondered if it was for the same reason. "Now, when I say, open your piece of paper but don't say anything, just walk over and stand next to your date for the night. Okay, now you can watch." Jill and Nancy opened their sheets and looked at each other. Then Jill walked over to me and kissed me on my open mouth, but I was a little nervous to fully appreciate it. Breaking the kiss, Jill said goodnight to me and stood next to John. Nancy then kissed John, wished him goodnight, walked over, took my hand, and we headed for the door. Once we were in the car, Nancy said, "I'm so glad it's over." Then she kissed me and asked, "Are you okay?" I replied that I was, and kissed her deeply. We sat in the car and kissed like teenagers for about 20 minutes. Finally, I said, "We better get going," and started the car and headed for the house. When we got back to the house, I poured us both a glass. And when Nancy sat down on the couch, I turned on some romantic music and joined her. I kissed her gently on the cheek and said, "I'm really sorry about all this. You know I was just kidding about the exchange when I said the four of us should do it. But before I knew what was going on, John had backed me into a corner that I was too drunk to get out of. I guess all's well that ends well." Nancy kissed me and said, "I forgive you, and I'm sure Jill has forgiven you, but I'm not sure it worked out the way John wanted it to." I felt much better now. I stood up, lifted Nancy to her feet, and we started dancing to a Sinatra song. As we danced, we kissed and ran our hands over each other. I put both hands on Nancy's beautiful body and pulled her to me. In response, she pressed herself against mine. It wasn't long before we started pulling each other's clothes off. I took Nancy's hand and we went upstairs to the bedroom. When we got on the bed, Nancy told me to lie on my back. I knew it would take me a while to recover, so I went downstairs and made us each another glass and brought it into the bedroom. We sat and talked while we drank. When our glasses were empty, Nancy climbed on top of me and started kissing my breasts. Then we made beautiful love and forgot about everything. Afterward, we cuddled together until we both fell asleep. And now I'm sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning. I had just finished my second cup when I heard a knock on the front door, which meant the newspaper had been delivered. I picked up the paper and sat reading until I heard Nancy taking a shower. I thought about going upstairs to join her in the shower, but decided to refrain. I had no time for that. Nancy went downstairs with a towel wrapped around her body, grabbed her clothes from the living room, and disappeared upstairs again. When she came back downstairs, she was already dressed. I made breakfast for us, and then we just sat and read the paper in silence. After a while, Nancy asked me if I was okay. "I guess I'm still not comfortable with all of this." Nancy replied, "Well, get over it or you'll go crazy." It was past 10 o'clock when I heard the sound of a car in the driveway. When I got to the door, Jill and John were walking down the driveway together. Even though it was a warm morning, Jill was wearing the raincoat she'd been wearing last night when I'd left her with John, and she had a small plastic bag under her arm. We exchanged greetings, and after a few awkward moments, Nancy and John drove off. As John's car pulled out of the driveway, I asked Jill if she was okay. Instead of answering, she threw the plastic bag on the couch and then let the raincoat slip off her shoulders and fall to the floor. It took me a few minutes to realize what I was seeing. Jill was standing in front of me, wearing a black satin bra and the same panties, a black garter belt, black stockings, black high-heeled shoes, and nothing else. The first thing that struck me was that she looked very attractive, but she had dressed that way for John, not for me. The second effect I experienced was when I took a closer look at Jill. Her neck was covered in red spots. Her breasts sat in her bra as if she had put it on in a hurry and didn't care how it looked. There were even more red spots on her stomach, and that's when I realized what was going on. Jill gave me a weird smile, stretched her arms out to the sides with palms up, and asked, "Do you like what you see?" Before I could answer, Jill turned to go upstairs. When she got halfway up the stairs, Jill turned to me and asked, "Are you coming?" I quickly followed her upstairs. Once in the bedroom, Jill looked at the unmade bed, then at me. I didn't know what to expect next. Jill walked over to me, put her hands behind my head, pulled me to her, and kissed me. Breaking the kiss, she pulled away and asked, "Did you like it?" I nodded affirmatively. Then Jill said, "Good." I could see that she wanted to hurt me, but for some reason it turned me on. Jill kissed me again and then took my hand and ran it over her body. It was a mess. Jill said, "Do you feel good? John had sex with me this morning just before we went here. That's why I'm not wearing any clothes. What do you think of your cheating wife now?" I picked Jill up and carried her to the bed and laid her on it. I then pulled down her panties and quickly freed myself from her clothes. As I prepared to have sex with Jill, she stopped me. She said, "Before you do that, I want you to clean my body." When I did, I quickly started having sex with her. Afterward, as we lay on the bed, I thought about what we had just done and decided that having Jill make me clean her body was her way of teaching me a lesson. I rolled over and kissed her and said, "I love you, and I will never do anything like that to you again." Afterward, as we lay next to each other and rested, Jill said, "Actually, I'd like to do it again." I was shocked. She continued, "Only next time I think we should do it together, all four of us in the same room. I think that would be sexy." As shocked as I was by that statement, I was equally turned on by the idea. I said, "Okay, then next Saturday we'll have John and Nancy over for dinner and bring it up with them." Then Jill asked, "If you're interested, could you wash my body again afterward?" That was one of the funniest things you've ever done to me. I replied, "We'll have to wait and see." The end! Subscribe to my channel. Thank you.